So this is a tale of a tale of a tale. It began in the fall of 2019 when there was a great rainstorm in the Nantahala Gorge, and just above Farabee Park there was an enormous landslide that just changed the river significantly. And people started to ask on social media, what about that dog's grave? Well, that dog's grave was the grave of Hala, who was Hugh Caldwell's dog. And all that discussion of Hala led to my presentation of the previous form of this to the Southern Appalachian Paddle Sports Museum that December. So let me start to tell you about Hala. So Hugh Caldwell and Merrie-Woode girls were paddling up and down the river in 1967, and Hala jumped into Hugh's boat, and he put notes along the river and in the restaurant and asked around, but nobody could say whose dog that was. And so Hala took that name and became Hugh's dog. And becoming Hugh's dog meant Hala became a camp dog. And he was the favorite of all the girls. Hugh went on a lot of river trips, and all the girls knew Hala. I also ought to digress here a little. In the opening picture and in a number of these pictures, people aren't wearing life jackets. And that was the standard back there in the early 60s. Unless you were in much bigger whitewater, you didn't wear life jackets. And this picture on the Tuckasegee is girls paddling down the river without life jackets. So don't get upset at that, but enjoy the show. So more pictures of Hala again on the Tuckasegee. Hala was just a friend of everybody and loved to go on river trips. And then when Hala passed on, Hugh carried him back and buried him in the pine grove just above Farabee on River Left. And that pine grove is now a housing development. But when it was still just a pine grove, I used to stop my river trips there and take the girls out and take them over and show them Hala's grave and tell them the story about Hala. But back to Hugh Caldwell. I grew up about 3 houses down from Hugh Caldwell, and my first memories of him were seeing him in this little sports car with his canoe trailer, zipping up and down the road, just getting back from a trip in time for classes, or zooming off after classes to take the canoe team out, or to get over to Merrie-Woode for the start of the next session. And that was basically what I knew of Hugh Caldwell until I got involved in whitewater paddling in the early 70s. And I purchased a book called The Southeastern Whitewater by Randy Carter. And I opened that book and found out that Hugh Caldwell was the most knowledgeable person around about whitewater. He had taken Randy Carter around and showed him all these streams and told him the tales of the first descents and all. And so Hugh became a hero. So let's look at Hugh. Hugh grew up in Atlanta. His father was a registrar at Georgia Tech, but Hugh's father died when he was fairly young, and Hugh's mother wanted him to have male role models. And so she sent him to the Fritz Orr camp, which is where the Westminster School is right now. And he became part of that camp as a camper and as a counselor, and then as he was going to college and then later on working on his PhD, he would spend his summers at the Fritz Orr camp. And this is the group from the Fritz Orr camp. Hugh is on the left. Next to him, going to the right, is Fritz Orr Jr. Then in the middle, in the leather jacket, is Fritz Orr Sr. And to his left is Ramon Eaton, or Ray Eaton, who worked with all the southeastern camps. He worked for the National Red Cross, and his job was to get canoe safety and river safety and lake safety and the use of life jackets as part of the regular program. I got to know Ray when I was working at Nantahala in the summer, because he taught the first aid and CPR courses in the pool room downstairs in his house. And of course, we'd always shoot pool and tell a few stories. So Ray Eaton became a great friend. And I think on his right is Ross Allen. Ross was a friend of the Orrs, and he often came to camp from his Florida home, bringing all sorts of critters, especially snakes, to show to the girls and explain what was dangerous and what was not. And so some quotes about Hugh. First from Bunny Johns. I can still see Hugh. He's got on a felt hat, got his pipe in his mouth. He was a philosophy professor, but he spent every summer at Merrie-Woode teaching kids how to canoe. And because he was a philosopher and also had a mathematical background, he made the kids understand why the strokes work, equal and opposite reaction forces and all that stuff. And so if you were going to be a captain, which was a big deal, you had to learn some theory with the actual strokes. Another from Will Leverett's History of Southeastern Whitewater, called Waterwise. Hugh Caldwell, a Sewanee professor and amazing early difficult river pioneer from Camp Merrie-Woode, had already run the Chattooga River sometime in the early 1950s, alone in an 18-foot aluminum canoe. He'd run sections 2 and 3 one day and had no real idea what was down there. He used a Gulf Oil road map as his only guide. Lots of people have done spectacular things for many years, but I consider this feat to be one of the most spectacular. That's Will Leverett. He was the first person down section 2 and 3, and later went on a trip with some Merrie-Woode girls and Mondamin folks that were the first to run section 4. And now to camp. Hugh was a philosophy professor and worked at Sewanee. And so when the Orrs sent out the postcard saying that camp was going to close and the girls should find a new place, Hugh got an option on the camp. I don't think the Orrs thought that he could raise that kind of money. A single bachelor taking care of his older mother in Atlanta. But Hugh got everybody together at Rebels Rest. That's the building in this picture, which was the guest house at Sewanee, on Thanksgiving weekend in 1978. And they talked about what to do about camp. And they decided to form the Merrie-Woode Foundation. And they asked Hugh if he would be the first director. And so Hugh then came into my office that next Monday and said, Doug, I'm going to be director of this thing. Would you consider coming and being head of trips? And that's how I got involved in camp, because of that crazy guy up the road with a little sports car pulling canoes. Here's a picture of Hugh teaching at camp. At camp at Sewanee, Camp Sewanee. In his academic gown. Here's young Hugh with Ray Eaton at Nantahala Falls. Another one with Hugh in the fedora hat, and next to him, I showed this picture to both of Horace Holden's sons, and they both said, "Gosh, that looks like Dad." But they said he never wore a ball cap, but we were all pretty sure that is him, and a bunch of Merrie-Woode girls scouting the Lower Toxaway, which is now under Lake Jocassee, in the valley. When Hugh had to go back and finish his PhD one summer, Horace took Hugh's place and served as head of trips that summer in the mid 50s. Another picture of Hugh and Horace and a couple of the girls. And here's the way we traveled back then. That's Hugh and Fritz Orr Sr. Standing on the ground in front of the truck. And we would just load up boats. This is actually a small trailer load. I used to put another boat on top, a board across the top 2 canoes, and another 3 canoes on top of that. But we would load up in the truck and go off on river trips. And the truck was really the way we carried the girls. We didn't have buses or vans back then. Another picture of the truck. And Hugh was quite a prankster. And I remember once he stopped at down in Silva at the cemetery and got out and banged on the side, got all the girls to look, and he said, "People are just dying to get in there." Laughed, jumped back in the cab, and drove off, leaving the girls thinking, "Oh, do we really stop for that?" So he loved to joke, and the big truck was really the way we traveled. You can see him dumping the girls after one trip. We would come in maybe from a river trip and dump the girls, and after supper we'd load up several cabins and go up to the top of Mount Toxaway, and we would make s'mores and sing songs, and maybe come back down and then take a Lake Toxaway trip the next day. And maybe more about that a little later. The girls, he was a real prankster, and he loved this, to take this picture. All the girls who made the Sunday trips, we would all hike Sunday afternoon up to Old Ball the first Sunday, and up to Cow Rock right above, hike straight up from high heaven up the side of the mountain. And then we'd go to Chimney Tops up above High Hampton the third Sunday. And all the girls who had done that, the older girls got to go to the Smokies with Hugh, and they all got their picture taken. It's really not as precipitous as it looks. There's a ledge he's standing on behind there. But each of the girls got their pictures taken there. And the younger girls got to go to Panther Town. We had some tent platforms there where we set up big squad tents, and the girls would stay 2 or 3 days at what we call the Panther Town Hilton. And I remember one time one girl took that seriously and actually packed her tennis racket for the trip. And here's Hugh on the Chattooga. They found an old canoe that had been torn up on the river, and of course we had to honor it and the lost canoe, and so that everybody is holding their hat. Still no life jackets. Hugh was a pacifist. One of the first things he did was to sell all the rifles at camp and close the rifle range, which was up where Merlin's is now. But he was also willing to make fun of himself. And here he is. He was always dressed really well, but here he is, the hippie freak. He with his "Stop the Bombing" sign during the Vietnam War. Here's Hugh being paddled around on a Sunday in a rocking chair in a canoe. And the girls. This is how we made the float for the whole show on Boat Meet, that we would just put these boards in between 2 canoes and swim them around before we had a proper float. And there's Hugh with probably the would-be's from that year. And in the early days of the foundation, one of the board members was the head of Camp Carolina, and we would have Highland games followed by dances, and he would always dress up for that. So here he is for the Carolina Highland Games. And he also led other trips. He wasn't just a paddler, but here he is ready to head out on a hike. Another picture from hikes. A picture up in the Smokies with some of the older girls. And here he is at Charlie's Bunyan in the Smokies. And up in North Georgia on one of the hikes. And here's a picture from Mount Toxaway. Every cabin got to go to Mount Toxaway for an overnight. we would go up after supper and we'd cook s'mores, and Hugh would sing to the girls, and we'd sleep out under the stars. So there was a little shelter there in case it rained. And overnight, he would put a dot of mercurochrome on each of the girls' noses, and in the morning say, well, that's where the Wampus cat kissed you. And that's where all that tradition comes from. Here's a picture from another trip. All the girls would get to go at one time or another to to Toxaway Falls, down below the highway. There's about a 60-foot slide into a pool at the bottom, and we would hike in and slide in the morning, and then sleep out and have rest period on the rocks, slide some more, and then come back to camp. That private property is completely surrounded that area, and probably the lawyers would say we shouldn't go there anyway. Another thing Hugh did when the foundation purchased camp is he went out and got a Santa suit. He loved Christmas. And so on Christmas Eve, the girls would come in their pajamas, and there'd be a big decorated tree in the dining hall, and he would read them Christmas stories. And then on Christmas morning, he would come in dressed as Santa Claus on one of the carriages there used to be several of them in the carriage house behind the barn. And with the caretaker would hook up one of the horses to it and bring him into camp. And he would have little presents for everybody. He really enjoyed the idea of Christmas. So we had a Christmas in June and a Christmas in July. And here's Hugh looking down on camp from one of the top of Old Ball from one of the Sunday hikes. Hugh was also quite a competitor. And here he is in Traveler. You can see that hanging in the boathouse in Hugh's room. That was one of the first deck boats in the Southeast. And you see now life jackets had come into the norm. He's wearing one of the old horse collar life jackets there. And here he is in a more modern deck canoe. He had a sabbatical one year in the 70s and up in Chicago, and there were tales of him dragging the canoe across the ice till he came to open water, and would get in it every day and paddle for an hour or two. And that year he won the Masters Whitewater National Championship. He also was a serious distance runner. You can see him second from the left. This is at the Chattanooga Marathon. The rest of the people aren't very Merrie-Woode except for Doug with the dark beard and the red sweatshirt there in the middle. And he coached the canoe team at Sewanee. Here, some of the people that have been through Merrie-Woode over the years. Jenny Lux, who's lying in the canoe there, worked at Merrie-Woode several summers. In the middle row, the second from the left, Lee Williams, who is Lee Steer now, worked at Merrie-Woode. The fellow in the back row with the tie in the middle is Steve Puckett, a great friend of Hugh's, a dean at the college at Sewanee, and who helped us coach the canoe team. Down in the middle, right against the canoe, is Doug Cameron, who helped coach the canoe team. So this was another one of his passions, and we won 11 out of 12 years that Hugh was coaching the canoe team for Sewanee, won the Southeastern Intercollegiate Championship. Another picture of Hugh running Nantahala Falls. And this is Hugh's roommate. Hugh lived in a cabin called Hilltop, which is where the office is now. It was a single-story cabin with a living room in the middle and bedrooms off to each side. And his roommate for a number of years there was Martin Begun. He was another deck canoe pioneer. He was the first person to run waterfalls in the Southeast. And here's the picture of him on the cover of American Whitewater, running Potter's Falls up in the Obed-Emery system. And a picture of Hugh on the Chattooga River, Section 3, with Jimmy Carter, who was then governor of Georgia, when they were studying the Chattooga to whether it should be a national wild and scenic river, Governor Carter wanted to learn about the Chattooga, and so he got an Atlantan, Fritz Orr, to arrange some trips with Camp Merrie-Woode. You can see that he was wearing a life jacket by then, but Jimmy's not. I don't know if that had to do with the opinion of politicians or what, but later on, Jimmy seemed to have gotten a life jacket. You don't want to sort of lose a future president on a camp trip. And here's the thank you note that Jimmy Carter wrote to Fritz Orr Sr. and to all the girls for taking him down the Chattooga River. So Hugh is remembered fondly by generations of Merrie-Woode girls, and adored by many. This is the last would-be class under the Orrs. They all came back to work for the Merrie-Woode Foundation that first wonderful summer in '79, where we had a full 6 weeks of camp, just one session, 100 girls, and it was a real work of love, an important year in keeping camp open. Out of these women, the second from the right on the back row is Jean Stevenson Blair, who actually was dean at West Point. And there are four Merrie-Woode parents now in that group. Here's Hugh with his camera. We had to take pictures, moving pictures as well as slides, and take them around every year to visit families and to recruit girls. We couldn't just say that we'll close on the 15th of September and then accept the girls from there and have a waiting list, because we didn't have that in those early days. A couple of more pictures of Hugh on the river and in the mountains. Hugh died in 1994 of throat and lung cancer from that ubiquitous pipe you see with him. But he is remembered fondly at Merrie-Woode and at Sewanee. This is his gravestone, and if you ever come to Sewanee, you ought to visit the University Cemetery and say hello to Hugh. He would appreciate it. And so that's the show. I'm glad I was able to share a little bit with you of my memories of Hugh Caldwell.